In 1961, Ian Fleming made his case to the producers casting the first James Bond movie. There was only one actor in the world he wanted playing Bond. His name was David Niven. The producers said no. Niven was 51, too old. They cast a 31-year-old unknown Scotsman who had worked as a milkman and an artist's model. His name was Sean Connery. But here's what almost nobody remembers. 6 years later, David Niven did get to play James Bond, the role Fleming had wanted him to have all along. And what should have been the role of a lifetime turned into one of the most chaotic, talent-stacked disasters in Hollywood history. This is the story of the Bond that Ian Fleming actually approved, and the gentleman who held everything together while the entire production fell apart around him. To understand why Fleming was so insistent, you have to start at a small white sand beach in Jamaica. In 1946, Ian Fleming bought a piece of land on the north shore of the island and built a modest house. He called it GoldenEye. From that year on, he spent 2 months there every winter, and that's where he wrote every single one of his James Bond novels. But Fleming didn't write alone. GoldenEye became a kind of clubhouse for Hollywood royalty on holiday. Noel Coward had a house just down the road. Errol Flynn drank martinis on the porch. Katharine Hepburn came through. So did Laurence Olivier, John Gielgud, and Audrey Hepburn. And so did David Niven. By the time Fleming sat down in 1952 to write the very first Bond novel, Casino Royale, he had a specific kind of man in his head. A British gentleman, war hero, witty, slightly weary, knew which fork to use at dinner, and exactly where to put a bullet if dinner went sideways. In other words, David Niven. Niven wasn't just playing a gentleman on screen, he had lived it. The day Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, Niven was already a Hollywood movie star. He could have stayed in California. Almost every other British actor in Hollywood did. The British Embassy actually advised them to. Niven sailed home anyway. He was the only major British star in Hollywood to enlist. He commanded a unit called Phantom in the elite commandos. He landed in Normandy after D-Day. By the end of the war, he was a lieutenant colonel and had earned the American Legion of Merit. That was the man Fleming was writing about. Fleming admired Niven so much that he wrote him into one of the novels. In You Only Live Twice, there's a pet cormorant on Blofeld's Island. Fleming named the bird David Niven. So when the time finally came to bring Bond to the big screen, Fleming knew exactly who he wanted. By 1961, Fleming had sold the film rights to 2 producers, Albert Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. They had a company called Eon Productions, and they were casting their first Bond movie, Dr. No. Fleming made his pitch. Niven had just won Best Actor at the Oscars in 1959 for Separate Tables. He was at the peak of his powers as a leading man. He was Fleming's first, second, and third choice. But Cubby Broccoli wasn't convinced. In his mind, Bond needed to be a young man's franchise. Niven was already an established gentleman star. Audiences would see him as too refined, too British, and, most damning of all, too old. So Broccoli passed on Fleming's first choice. He hired the 31-year-old Scotsman instead, Sean Connery. Fleming was furious. He famously called Connery an overgrown stuntman. He thought Broccoli was making a catastrophic mistake. Then Connery walked on screen and Fleming changed his mind. Dr. No was a massive hit. Bond became a global phenomenon, and David Niven watched the whole thing happen without him. But Fleming didn't live to see the rest of it. He died in 1964, just 3 years after the franchise launched, which is what made what happened next so strange. Back in 1955, before Eon Productions even existed, Fleming had made a deal. He sold the film rights to one specific Bond novel separately from all the others. That book was Casino Royale, the very first one he ever wrote. The rights eventually landed with an American producer named Charles K. Feldman. So while Broccoli and Saltzman were churning out Connery films at Eon, Feldman owned the rights to one Bond story they couldn't touch. He tried to collaborate on a joint film. The negotiation collapsed. So Feldman made a decision. If he couldn't make a real Bond movie, he'd make a parody of one. He picked up the phone and called David Niven. The setup was perfect. Niven would play the original Sir James Bond 007, now retired, living in luxury. The Connery character would be reframed as a kind of imposter, a newer agent who had stolen the legend. For Niven, this was the closest thing to vindication he was ever going to get. The role Fleming had always wanted him to play. Finally, his. But before a single frame was shot, the production was already heading toward catastrophe. Feldman's first decision was to hire one director. Then, somewhere along the way, he hired another, then another. By the time cameras rolled, he had 5 different directors handling different segments of the film. John Huston was running the David Niven scenes. Joe McGrath had the Peter Sellers material. Ken Hughes took the Berlin sequences. Robert Parrish handled other pieces. And Val Guest was brought in to try to stitch the whole mess together at the end. A 6th director, a stunt coordinator named Richard Talmadge, was quietly running the final action sequence without being credited. And the writing was somehow even worse. The official screenplay had 3 credited writers, but the uncredited contributions came from Woody Allen, Peter Sellers, Val Guest, Ben Hecht, Joseph Heller, Terry Southern, and Billy Wilder. That's the author of Catch-22, the director of Some Like It Hot, the man who wrote Notorious, all contributing to the same chaotic comedy, and none of them coordinating with each other. The cast was just as overloaded. Peter Sellers, Orson Welles, Woody Allen, Ursula Andress, Deborah Kerr, William Holden, Charles Boyer, Jean-Paul Belmondo. Even racing driver Sterling Moss showed up in an uncredited cameo. And then, it all went wrong. The first sign of trouble came from Peter Sellers. Sellers was supposed to play a baccarat expert named Evelyn Tremble, recruited to impersonate Bond at the casino. But he arrived on set with behavior that one director would later describe as completely impossible. He demanded a fully built set be torn down because he had a nightmare about it. He vanished from the studio for days, sometimes weeks, with no explanation. He got into a physical fistfight with one of his own directors, and eventually, with several of his most important scenes still unfilmed, he walked off the production for good. Fans still argue about whether Sellers quit or was fired. Either way, the writers had to scramble to invent entirely new scenes and characters to paper over the holes his exit left behind. That's why the final film ends up having 7 different James Bonds in it. 3 of them are women. None of it makes sense. But the real disaster wasn't Sellers walking off. It was what was happening before he walked off. Welles was cast as the villain Le Chiffre. He and Sellers were supposed to share several major scenes at the baccarat table. There was just one problem. They couldn't stand each other. The feud got so bad that the 2 actors flat out refused to be in the same room. Their scenes had to be filmed separately. Different days, different setups, stand-ins reading the off-camera lines. The director cut between them using clever camera angles to disguise the fact that the 2 leads had never actually shared a frame. And in the middle of all of this, the budget was bleeding out. Feldman had pitched the studio on a $6 million movie. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the cost had doubled to $12 million. That was more than the budget of Thunderball, the most successful actual James Bond movie of the entire decade. And through all of this, standing calmly in the eye of the storm, was 56-year-old David Niven. Niven's scenes were directed almost entirely by John Huston. They were filmed early in the production, before the worst of the chaos hit. By every account from the people who were there, they were the most coherent and watchable segments in the entire film. This was a man who had survived Sandhurst, who had landed in Normandy under enemy fire, who had buried the love of his life when she was just 28, and rebuilt himself in Hollywood from scratch. A film set with 5 directors and a runaway budget didn't fluster him in the slightest. He showed up, hit his marks, charmed the crew, told stories at lunch, and went home to his villa in the south of France. And here's the irony that almost no critic caught at the time. While the rest of the movie was descending into pie fights and flying saucers, and a finale involving cowboys, Indians, and the French Foreign Legion, Niven was quietly delivering the closest thing to Ian Fleming's literary James Bond that any actor had ever attempted. He drove a Bentley, not an Aston Martin. That was the car Fleming gave Bond in the books. He had blue eyes, just like the novels described. He was age-appropriate, since the literary Bond ages through the series into his late 40s. He carried himself with the sophistication of a man who had actually seen combat, because he actually had. The Bond that Fleming had imagined. The Bond Fleming had been asking for since 1961, quietly delivered, inside a movie that was on fire. Casino Royale opened in London on April 13, 1967. The critics tore it apart. They called it incoherent, bloated, a waste of one of the most expensive casts ever assembled. The film became a kind of Hollywood cautionary tale about what happens when too many cooks ruin the same bowl of soup. But here's the thing the critics missed. Audiences loved it. The film grossed $41.7 million globally. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $380 million in today's money. It was a genuine, undeniable box office hit. The Burt Bacharach theme song, The Look of Love, was nominated for an Academy Award and became a chart smash. The soundtrack album sold for years. But then, exactly 2 months after Niven's Bond hit theaters, Sean Connery's You Only Live Twice opened in the same cinemas. The real Bond, the official Bond, the Bond that Broccoli had built and audiences had grown to expect. It made more money, it got better reviews, and it absolutely buried any memory of David Niven's version. By 1968, almost nobody was talking about Casino Royale anymore. By the 1970s, it was a punchline. By the 1980s, it was forgotten. David Niven died in 1983 at the age of 73 from complications of ALS. He left behind nearly 90 films, an Academy Award, 2 best-selling memoirs, and a reputation as one of the most universally loved gentlemen Hollywood ever produced. But the question of what might have happened if Cubby Broccoli had said yes in 1961 is one of those great Hollywood what-ifs we will never get to answer. Would Niven's Bond have been more iconic than Connery's? Almost certainly not. Connery defined the role in a way that nobody had ever defined a screen character before. He turned Bond into a global brand. But would Niven's Bond have been closer to the character Fleming actually wrote? Almost certainly yes. And here's the strange final twist of the whole story. In recent years, as Bond fans have revisited the older films with fresh eyes, more and more critics have started to acknowledge what was hiding in plain sight in 1967. David Niven's Sir James Bond, surrounded by carnage and pie fights and Peter Sellers tantrums, was the most accurate portrayal of Ian Fleming's literary Bond ever put on screen. The actor Fleming had always wanted, who finally got the role. In the movie, nobody remembers. That's the strange ending of a story about a gentleman who showed up for the part of a lifetime, did his job with grace, went home, and let history forget the rest. David Niven once said the secret to a successful life was simple. Show up on time, know your lines, and be kind to people on the way up, because you'll meet them again on the way down. He spent his whole career living that rule. And maybe that's why, 4 decades after his death, people still remember him as the gentleman who could have been Bond. If you enjoyed this story, the next video on screen looks at another classic Hollywood legend who lost the role of a lifetime to a complete unknown. Click it to keep going.